What happens when a New York media insider trades glossy covers and deadlines for the quiet rhythm of a fly cast? In today's episode, you'll understand how one person's journey in fly fishing became a lifeline in the face of a life-altering diagnosis, what it's like to cast a fly rod on the streets of Manhattan, and some of the interesting looks you might get doing that, and how writing a memoir became an unexpected path towards peace. This is the Wet Fly Swimming Podcast, where I show you the best places to travel to for fly fishing, how to find the best resources and tools to prepare for that big trip, and what you can do to give back to the fish species we all love. John Gluck, from the magazine offices to Alaskan rivers, today's guest has lived through it all. He's written about it, and he's fished his way through it. Here we go. Let's get into it. John Gluck, writer, angler, and author of An Exercise in Uncertainty. So how you doing, John?
Good, Dave. How are you?
Great. We're going to get into a topic today, which is, not all, I guess, well, hopefully there's a lot of positive in the message today, but you have a form of incurable blood cancer. We're going to talk about that. The book you've written, An Exercise in Uncertainty. You've been out there writing for the New York Times. I know you've appeared on Oprah. I mean, it sounds like you have a great message. We're going to talk about that and how that might help people as we talk about fly fishing as well and how that's helped you through your process. But can you give us an update, where you're at, what you're dealing with? And we're going to get into more on fly fishing, but start there. How are things going these days?
Yeah, I mean, that's the positive part of the story for sure. If not, some people have told me downright inspiring, which is, yes, I do have this illness. And I was originally told I might have as little as 18 months to live, but that was 21 years ago. So that's
Wow.
kind of a cool story. It's not a stretch to say I'm something of a medical miracle. Since I was diagnosed, an incredible number of new treatments have come along, just, sort of by sheer luck and timing wise. And so I'm well. Right now I'm in a complete remission and just got back from a fishing trip about 10 days ago, in fact.
Wow. Okay. So maybe talk about we've got the book here, and you've also written, like we said, for the New York Times. What are you writing about? What are some of if somebody wanted to read some of the work you have out there, what are those articles focused on?
Yeah. So, my fishing stories, which you can find in the New York Times travel section and in Garden and Gun magazine and others, they're much standard travel stories. I've been lucky enough to business for a long time. And somewhere along the way, I realized, not that I need to tell you or your listeners, but, fishing can be an expensive sport, especially if you want to travel and fish some far-flung places. And I kind of developed this side gig of writing about fishing as a way to help finance, these trips and get out there and enjoy some places that maybe I wouldn't be able to go otherwise in terms of affordability. So started doing that on the side and wound up getting some really nice assignments. I've written about fishing in Chile and Patagonia. I've written about fishing in Alaska. I've written about fishing in Tetons in Wyoming and the Bahamas and Belize in the salt. So, I've got a pretty good gig. I'm not going to complain.
Yeah, right. Gotcha. So, and then you have obviously the backdrop of what you're dealing with maybe you can describe that. What is it sounds like it's incurable, although you've been able to deal with it. What is the blood cancer that you have?
Yeah. So I'll tell you the whole story real quickly. It's called multiple myeloma is the short answer to your question. But what happened was I was 37 years old and I left my office one night and I slipped on the ice. I live in New York and this was in downtown Manhattan. And it was 2002. And I woke up the next morning and I didn't even fall. It was just a tiny little slip. I just kind of twisted my hip. And I woke up the next morning, my hip hurt like a lot. And I was like, well, that's weird. Maybe I'm just getting old, starting to have joint problems or something. But it didn't go away for a few weeks. So I saw my doctor. He took an x-ray, didn't see anything. He just gave me a physical therapy prescription, went back about my business. Roughly a year went by and I realized, wow, this thing really hurts. It's been a year. It's not getting better. In the meantime, my wife and I had a baby girl, our first child. She was 7 months old. I was having trouble picking her up and putting her into the crib and things and getting up and downstairs. So I went back to the doctor. This time he took an MRI and called me to come in. And I went in. And the second I got to his office, I knew something was up. The receptionist was kind of weird, and she sort of looked over her shoulder the instant I got there, and they took me straight to an examining room instead of the waiting room. Doctor came in and he said, I need to tell you have a lesion on your hip. And I didn't even know what the word meant. I was like, is that, you mean a tumor? And he said, yes. And I said, is that cancer? And he said, yes. And just like that, lightning bolt out of the blue, I was, like I say, 37, had a new baby girl, doing well in my career. My wife and I just bought an apartment together and, had no risk factors for cancer, no family history of cancer. And, whammo, like you say, all these things happen to all of us, whether it's a health issue or something else. Sometimes life deals you a bad card. And, that was a pretty bad one for sure. In terms of how I reacted when you ask, immediately it's like my first reaction was just pure denial. Literally the first words out of my mouth were no, 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 no. And then I think I said something about, I have a baby daughter. This can't be happening. So, after I got my feet on the ground, I started to think more practically and, accept that this was happening and figure out what I needed to do and which doctors I needed to see. And that whole process unfolded over, many, many years. But that first reaction was just pure shock and denial.
Yeah. And at what point, so they say, you have 18 months. I mean, at what point did you realize like, well, things change and you've got more time, or how did that look?
Yeah. So it took a long time to get me an exact diagnosis. The MRI came back with a couple of different possibilities. And one of the things I learned pretty early on is that there are so many subtypes of cancer and subtypes to the subtypes and a lot of the symptoms and test results, whether that's imaging or blood tests, overlap. So it took them quite a while to diagnose me with exactly what I had. And once they knew that, at first they thought I had a bone cancer. So I saw a doctor who was appropriate for that. Then it turned out, as we mentioned, that I have actually a bone marrow cancer, something called multiple myeloma. So I went to the specialist for that. And he was the one who told me I might have as little as a year and a half, maybe 3 years. But he also said very pointedly, there are a lot of new drugs coming along, for what you have. And he said, obviously, I don't want to say you're lucky because, you're pretty unlucky at the moment in the scheme of things. He said, but within that, I want to tell you, there are a lot of new things coming along in the pipeline, that treatments that, probably aren't going to cure you, but can definitely, keep you motoring along. And I thought he was just kind of blowing smoke, to be honest, trying to give me hope and be positive at a time where I didn't really have a ton of hope or positivity. But he turned out to be 100% right. New treatments just started coming along one after another. And it wasn't until I wrote my book, which is called An Exercise in Uncertainty, which kind of gets at that whole question of, living with this much, with a big sword hanging over your head all the time. It wasn't until I started writing the book that I put together the timeline in a really precise way. And honestly, sometimes it's been unbelievable. Like, a new drug has come along. Basically what happens to me is I get sick, they treat me, I go into remission, I get sick again, they treat me with something else, and so on. And pretty much every time I've needed a new treatment, something has been approved by the FDA, sometimes like within months, honestly, and other times within maybe a year and a half. So I just happened to be diagnosed with this at a lucky time, to be honest.
Wow. And when you go through these periods of getting sick, what is that? What is the bone marrow cancer? What does that physically manifest as?
Yeah, it can manifest as different things, but primarily it's bone pain, and you get these lesions on your bone, like the first one they discovered. So I've had tumors on my hip bones, on my pelvis, on my thighs, on my skull. I once made the mistake, we all joke these days about like, oh, if you get sick, don't Google it. I would definitely subscribe to that advice, because I once made the mistake of Googling, my illness early on, and there were x-rays of people with what I have in an advanced stage, and their bones look like Swiss cheese, basically. They're just black spots over all their skeleton. So I've had, I don't know, I lost count long ago, dozens of these lesions all over the place. And that's primarily how it presents, as pain, bone pain.
Okay. Gotcha. And then those lesions, is it different than, I guess they have to cut those off, and it's not like a fast growing tumor like you might see with some other cancers sort of thing?
It's actually a great question. And, people sometimes said to me, well, couldn't you have a hip replacement and that would get rid of it? They don't removing the tumors in the bones for what I have doesn't do any good. So you have to be treated with radiation or chemotherapy or immunotherapy to stop the process itself. It's sort of like working its way from the inside out in a case like this, from your bone marrow out through your bones. So cutting out the manifestation of it in your bones doesn't really stop it. You've got to stop it in the blood, in the marrow. So that's why I've had all these other treatments.
Gotcha. So you haven't had to do chemotherapy at all?
I have, yeah, just no surgery.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I've done chemotherapy, radiation 4 times, chemotherapy twice. I've been on 4 different immunotherapy regimens. And then 2 summers ago, I was in the hospital for twice, for a couple of weeks once, and for 3 weeks the second time, a little more, to have this kind of mind-blowing, futuristic immunotherapy called CAR T therapy, which is like something out of sci-fi, basically. Like, they take your T cells out of your blood, which is one of the building blocks of your immune system. They send them to a lab and they engineer them with a molecule that when they put it back into you, it knows how to hunt down your cancer cells specifically. And in the meantime, they've turbocharged that immune cell, the T cell, so that when this molecule attaches the T cell to a cancer cell, it kills the cancer cell, but it doesn't kill the healthy tissue surrounding it or attack that tissue. So that's a big advantage, because when you have chemotherapy, that's just like carpet bombing, basically. It's like healthy tissue and unhealthy, but this is super targeted. And I had that treatment 2 years ago, and that's what put me into this current remission I'm in now.
Oh, wow. Okay. So as you look out now, I'm guessing, are you pretty positive now that it's been 20 years that you're going to keep, continuing? I mean, how does the outlook look now? Is there,
Yeah,
what I mean?
if you mean positive in the sense of certain, definitely not. If you mean positive in the sense of optimistic, definitely yes. I have this kind of thing I've come to think of it as over the years of like, optimistic realism. It's like I try and be realistic. And what I've been told by my doctors is they're probably never going to have a cure for this. At least they don't have one now. But as I've said, they have all these new treatments and more coming down the pike still now. So I'm just hopeful I can keep getting, to use a fishing analogy, just keep getting across the river, one stone at a time.
Yeah, I think it is. The uncertainty is interesting because, I mean, you have an extreme case, but I mean, everybody has the potential for, whether that's health related, you never know, whatever, getting in an accident, even the worldwide stuff, right? It seems like we're in this world of uncertainty, especially now with how politics are very uncertain, right? And so what is your advice for people listening now? That what could they take away from your story? Maybe they're going to be hit with something down the line, or there's going to be something that comes up. What could they take away from your book if they haven't read it yet that would help them?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the interesting things I did in researching the book was I talked to an expert on uncertainty, and she's like made it her whole life's work to study this subject. And she was telling me about this experiment that they did where they divided people into 2 groups and told them that they were going to get a small electrical shock, and half of them would and half of them wouldn't. One group would, one group wouldn't. And I forget the exact percentage, but a huge majority of the people before, very long, just said, you know what, just give me the shock. Like, they couldn't bear waiting, and they basically, like, it's really cool, right? I mean, they're basically saying uncertainty is so awful. I'd rather have like the negative thing and just get it over with than have to wait. So basically, it tells you how difficult uncertainty is for humans to deal with. And so I said to this woman, how do you deal with it? And, she said that their studies basically, and all her work has shown that, simple things like distracting yourself with, small distractions, take your mind off of things, just common sense. And she said kind of the best thing is like anything that gets you into like a flow state, right? Like a deeply absorbed, engaged mindset. So for some people that's, hiking or baking or yoga. For me, it's fly fishing. So that's, kind of why we're here, right? And before I got sick, was already a pretty avid fisherman, and it always brought me all kinds of pleasure, fun, joy, the way it does so many people. But after I got sick, it almost became like oxygen, like I needed it so badly to get away from my troubles. And we all know, when you're on the water staring at a, fly that's whatever, a 16th of an inch big, 30 feet from you, there's not a whole lot else you're thinking of. Your mind is fully engaged, So things like that can be super helpful, whatever your thing is, whether it's fishing or something else. But then I said to this woman who I spoke to, you're the expert. How do you deal with uncertainty? And she said, a lot of people ask me that. And she said, to be honest, she said, it's embarrassing, but not very well. And I said, well, that's depressing. And she said, no, not really. She said, what I like to tell people is it helps to know that everybody struggles with it, so that you feel like you realize you're not alone. It's just a difficult thing to deal with. And that said, there have definitely been some lessons I've learned along the way. I don't want to give cancer credit for anything good, ultimately, but you do learn, like a lot of people, right? Well, maybe somebody's been in a serious car accident or had some kind of near-death experience outdoors, or anything. You come back with this new sense of like, the two things for me have been like just a sense of urgency of like, live your life now, because, none of us is promised tomorrow, as they say. So I tend to not wait to do anything, kind of. I'm very quick on the trigger. If that could be small or large. If I want to have dinner with a friend, I don't sit around waiting. I'll just text them right that minute, say, hey, let's get some dinner, one of these days. Or if I want to go on a trip, as soon as I reasonably can, I figure out how to do that trip. I don't stroke my chin and, scratch my head a lot about stuff. The other thing is perspective, same thing. You've probably heard other people in my position talk about this, but little things really don't bother me so much anymore. My coworkers once named me Mr. Reasonable, as in like, nothing really kind of throws me at work, because deadlines and work problems, they're important. I care about them, of course, but they don't get me all in a tailspin like they used to. And then the last thing is, you can handle a lot more than you think. Maybe two more things. You can handle a lot more than you think. When I was first diagnosed, I didn't think I could handle what was coming my way. And now I've been through the gauntlet, 20 times over, and here I am and still living a good life and active and fishing and going to the gym. And now I have a second child. My wife and I decided to go ahead and have a second child. Kids are 22 and 17, I have a nice career, which leads me to the last point, which is, things sometimes turn out better than you think. That definitely you can get tossed a bad card, but it doesn't necessarily mean game over. For some people, unfortunately, that is the case, but for many people, it's not. And one of the things I've learned is just not to assume the worst. When you get bad news, that sometimes things can work out after all.
When it comes to high quality flies that truly elevate your fly fishing game, drifthook.com is the trusted source you need. I've been using Drifthook's expertly selected flies for a while now, and they never disappoint. Plus, they stand behind their products with a money-back guarantee. Are you ready to upgrade your fly box? Head over to drifthook.com today and use the code SWING at checkout to get 15% off your first order. That's Drifthook, DRIFTHOOK.com. Don't miss out. Pescador on the Fly offers a full range of fly fishing gear for any angler at any budget, with premium rods delivered directly to you. The El-Ray G6 is the most packable, high-performance fly rod on the market, performing like a 4-piece rod but with unmatched portability in 6 pieces. And you can get 10% off your next order right now if you use the code WETFLYSWING at pescadoronthefly.com. Never fly without your G6. Discover the El-Ray series and more at pescadoronthefly.com. Have you felt that way with what you've gone through? It's actually helped you. All the challenges have made your life better in some ways. Like you've learned along the way. How does that look? Do you take away as you look back at again, we talked about optimistics, but like positive, optimistic on what you've been through and what you're potentially going to go through?
Yeah, definitely. Like I say, I don't want to give cancer credit for anything too much. It's like, somebody once made a joke to me. Another person I knew who was sick said, don't be too, cancer's like a house guest, don't be too friendly or it'll stick around. So yeah. I don't want to be,
right.
But I'd be lying if I said I haven't learned some positive things from it. This idea of, like I say, optimistic realism. I don't do that. Some people say, oh, well, you got to have a good attitude to, beat this. That's tricky because, you don't want to put the blame on somebody who's already going through something really tough to like, oh, now you got to have a good attitude or you're going to make it worse. Right. So I'm not a big believer in that, but I am a big believer in the idea of, why not be optimistic just day to day? Like it just makes your life more pleasant, and I'm not saying I'm capable of that all the time. I'm here to tell you I'm not. I have my dark moments like we all do, but all in all, I've definitely learned exactly what you were saying a minute ago. Like trying to be positive and trying to hope for the best and, live your life to the fullest while you can. It's just, like I say, for me anyway, it's a better way to live my life day to day and just deal with the reality of this.
Gotcha. Take us back a little bit on your fly fishing. It sounds like you've been doing it a while. How'd you get into this, and what's your first memory of it?
Yeah, so my wife and I were on vacation in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and we had already gone hiking, biking, rafting. We'd done all the things you do in a place like that. And we were in our late 20s, early 30s, and we just went up to the hotel clerk, at this little place we were staying and said, we've done all this other stuff. Anything else you suggest, we should do while we're here? And she said, have you ever tried fly fishing? And both of us had fished with our parents and grandparents when we were little, but not very seriously at all. It was more like stock pond kind of stuff, or, one of those like, chartered deep sea cruises in Florida where, so, but we said, sure, yeah, let's give it a try. It happened to be around the time that A River Runs Through It came out. So that was like that, first big craze, got kicked off among wider number of people. So, that was, I think, in the back of our minds. Anyway, she set us up with a guide for the next morning, and he showed up and we went out, and we were rank beginners. So he started with casting lessons on the shore, and then we went out and we actually had an incredible day. We both caught a lot of fish, some nice cutties, wild native.
Who was that gave you the lesson? Do you remember?
Yeah, a guy who turned out to be, a very close friend of mine for all these years now, a guy named Tim Warren, who guides in that area. So he took us out that day. We had a great time. We had so much fun that he called his girlfriend afterward, and she came and met us, and we all went for drinks. And that started out kind of lifetime of fly fishing for me, and to some extent my wife. She doesn't fish as much as I do, but she definitely enjoys it. And a friendship between all of us as well that's lasted all these years. So, all of us who are out there a lot know, that's kind of half the fun of it, is all the people you meet. And we've been very lucky that way.
Right. Cool. So yeah, back to Jackson Hole, which we've done a ton of stuff. We're heading back there again to that area to do some more trips. It's a pretty amazing area. So as far as your travels, your books, it sounds like you've been up to Alaska, some places. How does that look? Is traveling something that is doable for you, that what you've been dealing with doesn't affect traveling? Talk about that a little bit, because I know the travel, sometimes this could be a little bit grueling process. You're on a plane for 5 hours and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's a great question. So on one level, it just made it impossible for me to travel at times where I've been too sick, to just endure the, hassles of travel, or the, hiking involved or waiting involved in a fishing trip. But that hasn't been the case so often. Usually, within a matter of months, I'm back on my feet and back out there. And that's always been super important to me, to get back out there as quick as I can, to kind of normalize my life and put a recent round of treatment behind me, get back to doing something I enjoy that makes me happy. But over the years, I've had a number of treatments that have left my immune system fairly damaged. And so during the pandemic, and in the couple of years after, even when most people were back to flying and traveling, I still had to be really careful. So if I traveled at all, I had to still wear a mask, even long after most people had stopped, take other basic precautions. But I don't know, either I'm a genius or an idiot, but I stayed committed to it, and I masked up and washed my hands a lot, and I couldn't not fish, and I could not go to my daughter's college to visit her, and certain other things were just too important to me. Sometimes I say to people, what's the use of living if you're not going to enjoy your life? And that's kind of the attitude I've taken toward that.
Yeah, so you're still able to do it. And it sounds like, were you up in Alaska recently, or what was the trip in Alaska that you headed out to?
I was there in 2022.
Okay, 2022, yeah.
Yeah. And I was on the Kitmai Peninsula, and that was just a classic. I was so fortunate. I wrote that story for Garden and Gun magazine, and I just, from the second I got there, I was like, just couldn't believe my good fortune to be able to do stuff like this. It was one of these classic.
Was this up near the Bristol Bay? What was the name of was this out of a lodge, or what was it?
It was out of Crystal Creek Lodge. It's a well-known lodge.
Oh, okay. Crystal Creek. Yeah.
Yeah. And terrific people. And, it was your classic Alaska float plane trip. And, every morning we'd get on the plane and they'd bomb us out to some place that, or another that barely been fished, or if it fished at all. And it was just spectacular. And, we did some salmon fishing. I caught my first ever salmon on a fly. We did, caught a bunch of rainbows, some Arctic char. And it was just, I couldn't get over the scale up there. I've been to some pretty cool places, but I've been very lucky. But yeah, everywhere you look, it's the biggest river you've ever seen or the biggest mountain range you've ever seen. And then there's 100 more rivers just like that and 100 more mountain ranges right behind it.
That's like awesome.
Mind blowing.
What time of year were you there?
I was there in June. Yeah.
Oh, June. So you're there
King
early.
Salmon run for the King Salmon run.
Did you guys actually fish for kings?
We did. It was pretty cool. And
oh, you did?
Yeah.
What river was the king salmon fishing on?
I'm gonna, off the top of my head, I want to say the Naknek.
Oh yeah, one of those. The Naknek. Yeah. So you fish. So basically, you're at this lodge which isn't on the Naknek, but you fly into these places.
Yeah, the lodge actually is on the Naknek, and you fly out of there to all kinds of places within whatever an hour's flying distance from there.
Yeah, gotcha. Wow. So yeah, you're on one of the, because that's the thing about Chinook, and I'm sure back then the runs were heading down too. But I mean, Chinook runs have been closed in the Kenai Peninsula. There's lots of really talk about uncertainty. One of the greatest salmonid fisheries in the world is on the brink, right, with closures and stuff. So there's not a lot of places you can fish for king salmon anymore in Alaska, but you're fishing one of the great ones. What was it like? Were you guys spey casting there or single hand rods? What were you doing there? First kings?
It was single hand rods, and it was we were very lucky. Like, I timed it pretty well, and there was a good run that year, even though, I'm well aware of all the issues you're talking about also. And that is a lot of uncertainty. But we got into some good ones. Of course, my best story is the one that got away, like it always is. You're going to think I'm making excuses, but I swear to you, it's true. We had an equipment failure. The guide himself was, took it on himself. They were all great guys and put me on some incredible fish. So I'm just joking when I say this, but we had a bad knot, and we had probably a 25, maybe bigger pound salmon right next to the boat. And snap, there goes the, right at the knot. And that was that. So, yeah.
You guys were fishing out of the boat for the most part?
Yeah, for the most part. Yeah. We also did some wade fishing, and I didn't catch any kings that way, but I did catch some silvers, and that was cool. Just, wading in a river like that, hooking into a big salmon, knee deep with, you've seen the pictures, of course, or maybe you've been there, with like a whole, dozen or 24 grizzlies, just 200 yards upriver from you, it was pretty heavenly.
Oh yeah. So you guys saw some bears while you're there?
Oh yeah. We saw a lot of bears. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. We just got back. I spent last month in Alaska doing a couple trips. So I'm hot off.
Amazing. Good for you. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm hot off the, everything. And it's exciting because especially the Chinook, that was a big goal of mine to get a Chinook on the fly, and finally to have them. Do you remember the salmon? Were they chewing the gum a little bit when they first bit your fly? Do you remember that a little bit?
I do. I don't know, that I have a whole lot more to add to that, but yeah, it was all super different and interesting.
Yeah, good. Yeah, that was the George Cook, who's been on this podcast a number of times. When he first said it, he said, man, you just, his biggest advice when fishing for Chinook salmon is let them chew the gum, because if you try to set the hook too early, you lose them. And I did that a couple of times, but then once you figure it out, it's this crazy, and a fish that's, more powerful than a steelhead, and a crazy experience. So that's cool. So you did Alaska, and it sounds like you've done some other places. What does it look like for you? Are you, as you look out, are you, well enough where you can now plan out, your next bucket list trip? How does that look? And are you, and where would that be, I guess, your next trip?
Yeah, I'm just starting to think about it. I am well enough at the moment. And like I was saying before, I try and take advantage of these things as quickly as I can because, I do maybe have a heightened appreciation for, striking while I'm capable, while the iron's hot. So I've been thinking about New Zealand. That's kind of one of the last of the epic places I haven't managed to get myself. I hear all kinds of stories, same as I'm sure you have, or again, maybe you've been there, but makes me a little nervous because you hear these stories of, monster, 32-inch browns, but you also hear people going all the way over there and catching, 2 fish in 10 days. So, I don't know that that's 100% true. You don't always, these, kind of stereotypes aren't always 100% true, but I guess there's probably something to it, which makes me a little nervous. On the other hand, I'm the kind of person who, once I get that image in my head of like a 32-inch brown, it's like, yeah, maybe I'm going, maybe it's worth the risk,
Right. Yeah, that's the thing. There's always the fishing where, it's fishing regardless of what happens, even if you don't catch a fish, which happens, especially if you're doing steelhead or something. You can still have a great trip, a great experience, because God, you go to New Zealand, how can you have a bad time in New Zealand?
Yeah, absolutely. And you took the words right out of my mouth, because as much as I joke about, catching a big fish, it's like, I'm sure I'd have an incredible time and see some incredible things. And, it just is a part of the world I haven't been to at all. So yeah, that's definitely high on my bucket list.
Yeah. It is always, whenever I hear the catch, because I think of we're all the same way. It's like, oh man, I want to catch a big fish, but it always sounds funny to me because I'm like, well, catching a big fish, and I did that Chinook fishing. Like, well, I wanted a big fish, but at the end of the day, regardless, it's going to be good. So yeah. So it sounds like you've been to a number of places around. I mean, there's so many places too. We talk about this, like even in a lifetime, if you've got probably more money than anybody or more opportunity, you still can't get everywhere, right? Because you've got, Kamchatka, you've got all around the world. But it sounds like you've been a lot of places. Is that what your writings, talk about that? So you've written for the New York Times, you've written for Oprah. Have all these articles been focused on your illness and really fly fishing, or have you gone deep into some of these specific areas you fished?
Yeah, the stories I've done for the Times have all been places I've fished, and Patagonia, Chilean Patagonia was one spectacular trip. That's another place where I lost a big fish, although those are always the ones you remember, like I was saying. That one was 100% my fault. I had, probably the biggest brown I've ever had on my line within about 3 feet of the net. And I just got too excited and lost my concentration and just kind of bowed to him with the rod, maybe, I don't know, not even that much, but enough to like give him a tiny bit of slack and spit the hook and bye-bye. But I saw him. So, like you say, there's lots of, and I got him to eat. So that was all cool. And that was like Alaska. Like the scale of it blew my mind. I have some incredible pictures, and just even in my mind's eye, I can remember it so vividly. And the rivers are so clear there. They have a lot of that glacial silt in them too. And so they have that almost sapphire blue color, which is also unforgettable. And I stayed at a place down there called Magic Waters Lodge, and same thing, terrific lodge, amazing people, all the usual stuff for a high-end lodge like that. Incredible food, great guides, great lodge itself. And we fished, I don't know, same thing I was saying about Alaska, I don't know, probably 10 different places, and half of them had probably barely been fished, if maybe not fished at all. For me, these days, it just gets more and more about the solitude, and getting away from the crowds, and maybe it's to some place that, is lightly fished. And as I was saying earlier, I'm lucky to have this, gig doing it that allows me to do that. As far as the salt goes, I've been to the Bahamas a number of times and got into some good bonefish. I went with a buddy of mine who is also a guide, another guy. And the fun part of that trip is he's about 100 times better fisherman than I am. But I got into maybe like a 7-pound bone one day that was the fish of the trip. And, I'll never forget that either. That one I actually landed, have a nice picture of. But, he, of course, caught, way more fish than I did. And like I say, on any day would always outfish me. But that's always the way it goes, right? It's like somehow the beginner always gets the best fish. And that was me that trip.
Right. Nice. Gotcha. So you've been to some of these cool places. On the, back to the book on an exercise in uncertainty, what is, again, for somebody who hopefully people will pick up the book and read it, but for those that haven't, how do you, maybe talk about, what was the hardest part of writing that book, or give us the synopsis of like what people can expect on that?
Yeah, I'd say probably the hardest part was just reliving a lot of what I've been through. The human mind is really pretty incredible about erasing stuff, that it doesn't want to consciously remember. And, some friends and family of mine had said when I started writing the book, wow, do you really want to go back down that road? And, I was a little concerned about it, but for the most part, it wasn't a problem. From time to time, I'd come across one moment along along the road I've been down that was, maybe more upsetting than some of the others. And those, that was hard. But the truth is, compared to, I have a number of friends doing what I do who've written books, and I'm almost a little sheepish about saying this because I feel like they're going to kill me. But, writing a memoir, a book about yourself, is a lot easier, frankly, than writing a book that requires a ton of reporting, about things that you don't know.
Or tips and tricks, or if you're writing a book like Tom Rosenbauer might write, where it's like, whatever, how to learn the Euro nymph.
Yeah, exactly. Where you got to gather a lot of information. The truth is there's quite a bit of reporting in this book, both about like the psychological aspect of dealing with uncertainty. And we talked about that a little bit earlier, and also about the science behind what I've been through. For anyone who's interested in science or medicine, there's quite a bit in the book about that. But mostly it's just, my story. And so, 70% maybe. So that part of the book was actually sort of, I don't want to say easy, but not especially complicated to write. And in a weird way, enjoyable, in spite of what I said earlier. There were definitely some moments of reliving things that were upsetting, but it's kind of cool to go back and really think hard about like, how often do we ever do that? Maybe for a minute or two here and there, but it was like, in a way, some of it was like looking at a cool photo album or something, where you're like, oh, I remember when that happened. That was nice. Or, and as I was saying earlier, in spite of dealing with something pretty heavy and intense, there've been some great moments along the way when good things have happened. And so reliving those parts was, actually really nice.
Step into the world where the river whispers and the fishing is nothing short of legendary. This year, I ventured into the heart of eastern Idaho's Yellowstone Teton territory, where the fish were larger than life and the waters held the secrets of the best fly fishing out west. Yellowstone Teton territory is not just a location, it's a gateway to adventures that will etch themselves into your memory. With crystal clear rivers like the Henry's Fork and the South Fork of the Snake, and enough lakes to keep you going all year long, make your way to Yellowstone Teton territory and embark on a journey to one of North America's finest fly fishing destinations. Whether you're planning your trip now or just dreaming it up, the YTT is where those dreams turn into reality. Remember, Yellowstone Teton territory. That's Teton, Teton. It's time to experience Eastern Idaho for yourself and support this podcast at the same time. Do you have a background? Talk about that a little bit for your writing. You've written, it sounds like, not only the book, but all the articles. Is that kind of what you've done, or talk about how you got to that level?
Yeah, that's my career. I'm a magazine editor. I worked at Men's Journal magazine. I worked at New York magazine. I've worked at a number of other magazines. Right now, I work at Fast Company magazine, the business and technology publication. And I started out, I was one of these people who kind of knew what he wanted to do from a pretty young age. I was the editor of my high school newspaper. I was an editor on my college newspaper, came out of school and fairly quickly got a job as a fact checker, which is, the lowest rung on the ladder at a newspaper or magazine, pretty much. And just kind of started working my way up from there. My first job was in San Francisco, actually Chicago. I had an internship then in San Francisco. And then I moved back here to New York, where, most of the publishing business is. And I worked for Men's Journal magazine, which does a lot of outdoor adventure sports coverage, or did at the time. And that's kind of where that was around the same time my wife and I took that trip to Jackson, and I had been working on stories about fly fishing and, other outdoor sports. So all that was kind of in my mind. It all just kind of came together at that point, my career, my hobbies, my marriage, all of it. And just kind of meshed into one.
Gotcha. So now you're currently working at Fast Company. What magazine, is that right?
That's right.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not familiar with that one. So that one, you guys focusing on business and tech. Is that describe that a little bit? What somebody could expect from the next, an article or a magazine there?
Yeah, it's a great publication. It started during the first .com boom, and it focuses on a lot about entrepreneurship and people running their own businesses, and also on some of the companies that are more maybe fun or exciting than the old stodgy companies. So we focus on a lot of tech startups and a lot of the also issues that people are, going through in their own work lives. There's a lot of coverage that I work on having to do with, how to get ahead in your career, or, how to learn new skills, or how to navigate office politics and, all the kind of day-to-day stuff that we all experience at work. Some of that stuff's relatable to everybody, as opposed to some of the stuff that's maybe about being a tech company founder or something that's exciting and interesting. And I enjoy working on that, but maybe a little bit less relatable to the average person. So it's a nice mix of both of those things.
So yeah, that sounds like a magazine. I would probably be one of your, probably a target customer of that, since, with the business and entrepreneurship and stuff like that.
I think you'd really enjoy it for sure. There's a lot about, running your business, and we cover a lot about media and the creator economy. And I think there's a lot on there you'd find interesting.
Yeah, it has been a very, the changes we've seen, right, have been pretty amazing to see where we're at now, where everybody has the social, not only social media, but can literally start a business in, a lot easier than before. And then, and then the creator economy and all that, which is not easy. Business will never be easy, but if you stick with it, you can have success. What is your, without going too deep into this, what is your, since you're an editor there, what's your best advice to a new business or somebody who wants to kind of have success? Like, is that easy to break down, or where would you point somebody?
Yeah, it's funny you ask, because you just said it, and I was thinking it before you even asked the question, when you said you got to stick with it, and related to that, I guess, closely related, it's maybe, other side of the same coin. You have to be passionate about it. I mean, it's not going to, especially with the creator economy, people hear these stories of like somebody starts a TikTok account and something goes viral, and next thing you know, they're an influencer and they're making, $300,000 a year. That's one in a million, right?
Yeah,
that's like making it to the NBA.
Yeah.
The rest of us who do this sort of thing for a living know that it's about hard work, showing up every day, caring about it, respecting your audience. That's another, or your customers, a big part of it, and not talking down to them or trying to trick them, being honest and straightforward with your deals, and not putting up clickbaity headlines that, maybe get you a little attention in the short run, but aren't going to get you any business, repeat business in the long run. So yeah, I would say set your expectations realistically. It can definitely work, and it works for a lot of people, but it's not going to happen overnight. One in a million, it does. But you got to really maybe have a 3 to 5 year plan and stick with that, and then you get some nice traction and can have a decent business.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great advice. Cool. Well, before we get out of here in a little bit, what other, takeaways should we have from your book? Obviously we'll send people out to where they can pick it up there, but I mean, it sounds to me like it's, inspiration, right? I mean, you've dealt with a lot of adversity, and you maybe still will have adversity, but you sound like you're positive to me. And I feel like that's how I am too. I'm always thinking like, man, you never know what the world's going to deal you, but you got to kind of stay in the game. Any other takeaways we'd have from this book or any of the other work you've done before we head out of here in a bit?
Yeah, I would say, a lot of people have told me something along the lines of what you were just getting at, like, well, I heard this book was about cancer, and I thought, well, that's going to be kind of heavy or depressing. And then they say, but it turns out it was incredibly inspiring, and I'm really glad I read it. And, that makes me incredibly happy, because that was my purpose. That was my intention, is not to bring people down, but to lift them up, basically. And to help people see that you can, like I was saying before, get dealt a pretty nasty blow and still, kind of come through it. Like I say, I've been lucky enough that quite a few people have told me they find that uplifting and inspiring. Just to be a little more specific with it, as far as what I would say, I've learned, or what the value of the book is. Going way back to when I was literally the first day I was diagnosed, I remember thinking to myself that there's this kind of death force, for lack of a better word, where like, we're all going to die someday. And, we know that that's going to, come knocking on our door. And I remember thinking that day, like, wow, this is, by far the closest I've ever been to that. But I also remember my very next thought was, well, there's also like a life force, a survival instinct, and we all have this programmed into us super deeply, that to survive. And I just thought to myself, I got to believe in the life force. I got to count on the fact that, I still am pretty healthy and the scheme of things, and I'm relatively young, and I'm just going to try and best I can trust that like this powerful instinct we all have inside us to survive and enjoy our lives and be happy and spend time with our families and our friends and doing the things we love, fishing, other things, that was going to kick in and at least give me a fighting chance. And, here I am 21 years later. So, it turned out to be the right idea, I think.
Nice. Perfect. Well, let's take it out of here today with our gear review segment. I'm not sure if you guys do this as an editor. I love the magazines because sometimes you see these. I think sometimes they're very popular parts of the magazines where they do
Oh
this
yeah,
annual
definitely.
gear reviews. But we also do that here, and we have some partners on. And so today I'm going to give a big shout out to Patagonia, their Swift Current waders. I just got off a trip. I've been living in their waders, and they're awesome. There's a few features on them that make them unique to, obviously there's great waders out there all the time, but the kind of the piss zip, right? The zipper down the middle for guys is a game changer, especially if you're in cold weather and all that stuff. But so we're going to give a big shout out to Patagonia. We love them. We love all the conservation work they do. But for you, as we get into this segment, first off, do you guys do that? Have you ever done any of the gear review stuff with any of the magazines you've worked with?
Yeah, we definitely do gear reviews. Going back to Men's Journal, we did a lot of fishing stuff and hiking stuff and biking and climbing and, other places I've been. When I worked at New York Magazine here in the city, we didn't do gear reviews, but we did a lot of restaurant reviews and shopping guides. So I happened to be the editor of our restaurant critic, and I got to go out to eat with him a lot, which was kind of a sweet gig. And at Fast Company, we do tech reviews, new software releases, new phones, that sort of thing. So yeah, it's always, people love it. Like you were saying before, people really want to know what's good and what's not and what to spend their money on.
Exactly. So that's where we're coming in here. And Patagonia, I think, also has great, we love them because they're such a inspiration for conservation and kind of protecting the species we all love, right? But what is, if you talk about gear a little bit, do you have a favorite piece or some stuff that you kind of don't leave home without, that you've been using on some of your travels?
Honestly, I didn't know until just this second that, Patagonia is a partner of yours. But one of the things I bought recently that I love is their waterproof backpack.
Oh yeah.
I was just in a, absolutely driving rainstorm, the kind where you're like, there's no way this stuff's going to be dry inside this bag. And I promise your listeners, I am not paid by Patagonia. I have no partnership with them. It's coincidence that you brought it up because I was really blown away by it. Like it is truly waterproof. And so I definitely like that. I've got a nice Orvis Helios 2 6-weight that I like. And I've got a nice 5-weight that was given to me as a gift when I left a job to take a new job at one point. That's kind of like a treasured gift because the folks I worked with had it, my name engraved on it. So that's like a special piece of gear. Yeah. So those are the two that come to mind.
Nice. Yeah, I love the Orvis. Obviously, is another great company. That's the cool thing about fly fishing. I think there's a lot of really amazing companies: Patagonia, Orvis, and I think we just re-released an episode we did. I interviewed Yvon Chenard, and to have him, sitting, across from him, asking this guy who
That's
is
so cool. Yeah, legend, legitimate legend.
yeah, legend. And you're in that space, so I love one of the things I remember from that podcast is I asked him, I can't remember what we were talking about exactly, but he basically said in his business, life, he's always done the opposite, like opposite of everybody, and it's always worked. It's always worked. And so I always think about that, the fact that, be different. You can't do the same stuff, marketing, whatever, because you just have to be different. And he's been, and of course he gives the company away, to the, basically to the planet, right, to help protect that. What is your take on that? Do you find some businesses that out there? I mean, the tech company is interesting because you hear a lot of maybe the negative stuff, stuff going on out there where people are just focused on the money and nothing else. What's your take on the business side of it? Do you see a lot of positives out there with companies?
Yeah, one of the things Fast Company has always focused on is companies that are innovative and do have an eye on things like sustainability. So we do like an annual list of the most innovative companies, and I would point people to that. It's easy to search, just Fast Company, most innovative companies. And there's all kinds of inspiring, companies on those lists that are doing things that we can all feel really good about, and in a responsible way. So, I'm not naive. I know there are plenty of companies who don't do that, but we try at least once a year anyway with this special issue we do to shine a light on some of the good work people are doing, some of the more positive things, some of the more optimistic things. And, I would point people to that list. There's all kinds of examples.
Perfect. No, we'll get that in the show notes as well for this, so people can take a look at that, and we'll follow up with you on everything here. And Oprah, I think. But any other big articles you want to give us heads up on? We can take a look at that are out there that you haven't mentioned yet.
Yeah, my family and I, my wife and kids, were all featured in People magazine last month. Yeah, so that was kind of the biggest fish we've gotten. Yeah, so that's also very easy to Google. You could just Google People magazine and my name, Jonathan Gluck.
Okay. What was that about? What was the People magazine? And
that was
your
about
family?
The book. That was when my book came out, An Exercise in Uncertainty, and they were basically retelling our story, that I've had this incredible, that I am, like I said, in some ways kind of a medical miracle, that I was given 18 months to live. And miraculously enough, I'm here 21 years later and have a nice family and nice job and enjoy fishing and other things. And it was just kind of an uplifting story that way.
Right. And it's in fly fishing too. Do you find when you do the more of the national stuff, because I'm guessing the audience for People magazine is probably whatever point something percent fly fisher anglers, but do you find that you think you have a big influence on getting people into fly fishing? Is that something you think about?
Yeah, I would say the interesting thing about that is it's more people than you think, come forward and comment on that. It's like, here I am in the middle of this like super serious story, right, about like my life and death and my family. And a lot of the letters and emails I get are like, oh, I love what you said about fly fishing, and I also have this is actually, you're asking me about other articles. I should have thought of this. I wrote about, I have this weird habit where I practice my casting on the street right in front of my apartment. So I live in downtown Manhattan on a busy street, 12th Street, West 12th Street. And I tend to try and go on Sunday mornings when it's relatively quiet. But I go down there, I take the hook off the fly, and, I just go out to practice casting. I could go up to Central Park or something, but it's a little, out of my way. So I just go out there, and what I do is I wait. I kind of follow the traffic light cycle. So when the light's red and there are no cars coming down the street, I kind of step into the street, maybe make 10 or 12 casts, and then the light changes and I have to step back onto the sidewalk.
That's awesome.
And people think I'm absolutely out of my mind, the looks I get and the comments and people taking pictures. Actually, friends of mine have sent me links to Instagram stories, and posts where they're like, holy
yep.
Sorry, I don't know if I'm allowed to swear.
Yeah, it's fine. No, it's fine.
They're like, holy dude, like, I was just flicking through my Instagram. There's a picture of you casting in front of your building. And I wrote a story about that for the New York Times. I think it was called, what was it called? Fly fishing in the street is strange and weird, but I love it, or something like that. But again, if you just Google my name and New York Times fishing or something, you'll get all my stories, and that should be one of them.
That's awesome. I think that, this goes back to that being different, like that's a perfect example of, you don't see it, right? You're doing something different. And that would be a great marketing opportunity if you wanted to get into it, right? I could see something with your book out there, right, along the street, and you're promoting that. But
that's true. That's a good idea.
The New York Times, we've also had Jim Teeney. I'm not sure if you've heard of him. He's kind of a friend of ours, and he's a guy that really started. He's an old school guy. He's the guy that you can attribute all the sinking lines that we have today to, because he started building those back in the 60s and 70s. But he also had an article in the New York Times back in probably the 80s or something there that was called something like "Man Throws Rocks at Fish" or something like that, right? Because he was a steelhead angler, and he got a lot of, well, I guess you'd call it bad press, but really it's probably got him, more people knowing about him. But essentially they said something about he throws rocks, not at fish, but maybe down a stream of fish to get them to move up and out in the areas where he might be able to hook the steelhead, right?
Yeah.
So, but it was a New York Times article, right? It made it to the New York Times, which is, is there anything bigger than that? What's your take on it? When you do things like you're talking about that, you're getting a press, do you feel like there's one area that you enjoy more than others? Like people, I'm guessing you had a lot more replies there from maybe some of the smaller stuff. But what do you love doing most? Do you love the fly fishing? Do you love the business? Do you love what's your favorite thing to write about?
Yeah, honestly, it's interesting. Way back toward the beginning of our talk, you were talking about how some people, when they get sick, they decide they're going to like chuck it all, quit their job, maybe go fly fishing every day. Interestingly enough, like I thought about that, but I didn't do it because I basically like my day job and I like what I do. I'm lucky that way. So I enjoy all of it, is the honest answer. But there's no question that this, like I say, side gig I've kind of developed writing about fishing, because that combines two of my passions in the same thing. writing and fishing. So there's no doubt that I enjoy that, and I, of course, enjoyed writing this memoir, my book, but that's a different kind of enjoyment because it's so heavy in some ways, and so serious. But like these fishing trips, like I say, I'm lucky I get to go to places there's no way I could afford otherwise to go, but getting paid, to go there to write about them is amazing. And then just the process. The other thing that's cool about writing about a fishing trip is it makes you pay even more attention. So I kind of feel like I get more out of the trips that I'm on when I have a writing assignment because I'm constantly paying attention and taking notes, or even if it's only mental notes until I can get back to the lodge and take actual notes, or just jotting punching a few thoughts into my phone. It kind of makes the experience even deeper and more intense than when I'm not writing a story. So I'd have to say, pretty much hands down, that's my favorite part favorite part of my writing career is the fishing writing.
Yeah, because you get to do that stuff. And it's interesting because we have a similar thing, although I'm not a great writer. That's one thing I've never enjoyed that much.
I bet you are.
But I do love the audio, and we do the trips. We come back and have our own form of telling those stories and stuff
Nice.
like that. But let's take it out of here with a couple of our a little bit of random and a little bit of not so random. But first on the writing, just influences. I feel like we've had a lot of amazing authors on this program. John Gierach, one of the best in our space, who passed away. And
yeah,
he was a big inspiration of his writing, the way he wrote, just him as a person. He was just a great person. But who is that for you? Do you have like an inspiration in your writing? Do you have like influences that people could see in your writing?
Yeah, some of them are obvious ones, I guess, that probably lots of people that you've talked about or thought about, going all the way back to Hemingway, who obviously was a huge fisherman. More recently, Tom McGuane, big influence, Jim Harrison, huge influence. And then some people who are maybe not quite so obvious, but the novelist Richard Ford, who also is a fisherman and writes about fishing a bit. I'm a huge fan of his work. In part because one of the things I'd say all of these people have in common is they're all very plain spoken. And I try and, be that way in my writing as well. It's not too flowery or fluffy or over intellectualized, I guess you could say. I try and just think and see things as clearly as I can and write them down. Like whenever I get stuck, that's kind of like my North Star I go back to is like, if you were just talking to a smart friend of yours, what would you tell them about this trip, or what you saw or what you thought or what you felt, and just put that down in plain, clear language. So I think I learned, I hope I learned from all those folks. Peter Heller, I've read all his books. I don't know if you've read Dog Stars or any of the others. He writes beautifully about the outdoors, novels. Yeah, I'd say those are some of the big ones.
There's a lot of great, and Tom McGuane, we're hopeful to have him on the podcast soon as well.
He's got great stories.
Yeah, he does. And Hemingway, of course, we had an episode we did on Hemingway and talked about the influence, and probably no person bigger than the way he wrote changed the game for everybody, right?
Absolutely. And he kind of pioneered this whole idea of, simple sentences, plain spoken language that can convey, he had that whole thing about it. Writing should be like an iceberg, you should only see the tip and the rest should be underneath. So
that's it, where people are reading it and making their own, they're doing their own, what would be the advice? How would you explain that with Hemingway's? Because it's not about you're not telling them the whole story. People are reading it, getting a little tip of it, and then figuring it out as they go, right?
Yeah, it's kind of I don't know, maybe inspiring people to think about what's happening instead of telling them what's happening, and just kind of engaging them into, wow, that's interesting, and makes them think 10 more thoughts that he hasn't put on the page, but he's kind of provoked you to think about them a bit.
Perfect. Well, one, just to take it out of here. So we have podcasts, we have music. I love to get both the take on this. Do you listen to more podcasts or music throughout the day, or if you're on a road trip?
Yeah, usually music, to be honest. Although having written this book now, and I've been lucky enough to be on a number of podcasts, I've got some new favorites. Obviously, I'll be listening to yours from this point forward. But yeah, I'm more of a music guy, and my tastes tend to run pretty obvious and old school, Neil Young, Van Morrison, The Dead, Pearl Jam, I'll occasionally sort of move into some bluegrass or something. But those are my go-to hardcore, Tom Petty, big Tom Petty
Right.
fan, So I can't say I have any like super alternative, cutting edge, music tastes or ideas to share, but
It's hard. Music is tough, even with I think Spotify and Apple Podcasts, the way they do the algorithm where it kind of picks stuff based on, and it gives you stuff. That's good. We were on a road trip. Well, we went up there, like we said, to Alaska. We have a membership group, Wet Fly Swing Pro, which is pretty amazing. We're building now with people who want to connect with other listeners, and it's just been a cool place. And now the trips we do are with members, listeners who are in our community. And so we just went on one. I was on a road trip with Alex and Brandon, and we basically drove up from Anchorage and just were on a road trip. And Alex had all this great music. And pretty much he became the guy the whole road trip was him playing his music. And I can't remember all of it. I wish I could have. One of them was Houndmouth. So I'll throw out, I didn't even know it. But it's so good. Music is so good because it's like one song or one group can change your whole thing and give you a bunch of new things to listen to, because I love the classic rock as well. But getting a change and maybe listening to something that is new is also awesome too. So
it's funny you say that, because you triggered a cool memory where my family and I went on a trip to Iceland. We actually didn't fish, which was kind of hard for me. I was itching everywhere we went, and it was just one of those times where, how it is on a road trip. Sometimes like you hear a new band and it becomes almost like the soundtrack of the trip. I don't know if you know that band Kaleo, but that was our band for that trip. And that's a band that, not everybody knows. They're Icelandic. And
oh, okay. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Super cool band. And then funny enough, this was a year or two after we were there. I'm watching football on a Sunday, and I think Fox was using them as like the intro and outro music from the commercials. So, they kind of had a little mini moment, but that's a great band. I would recommend it. Maybe isn't as obvious. And they have kind of a fishing outdoors vibe. I don't know how to explain it, but they sort of do.
Kaleo, is that, how do you spell that?
Yeah, it looks like it's Kaleo.
Oh yeah, Kaleo. Yeah, Kaleo. Okay, perfect. So good. Yeah, I think that's always fun. And then on the podcast, so we can put a couple in there, right? April Vokey, we mentioned, Tom Rowland. Are there other podcasts that you're looking at potentially maybe connecting with, or the other ones you listen to out there?
I think that's it fishing wise. I'm super grateful and, lucky I've been on all your podcasts. And it's funny, you mentioned Tom Rosenbauer earlier, and he was nice enough to give me a little blurb for my book.
Oh, he did?
And yeah, he's great. Super nice guy. But it's funny you brought it up yourself, but like he focuses almost totally strictly on how-to kind of stuff. So we talked for a minute, and he was very generous about, even hearing me out about me being on his podcast, but it's not the right subject. He's more of a, like you say, like, here's how you're an nymph kind of guy, which is awesome.
Yeah.
But, I don't think I'd be the right fit for him.
Right. Yeah. Rosenbauer. Yeah. That's the interesting thing. Cause I think, two of my biggest influences before I started back in even before, it's been 10 years now since I had the idea of this. But yeah, Rosenbauer and April and others, but those were two that I listened to a lot, because Tom was just, he's one of the oldest podcasts, but April also had a lot of the steelhead stuff. But yeah, I think our show is interesting because we're diverse. Like I said, I've interviewed everybody from, Henry Winkler, the Fonz, to, I mentioned Yvonne Chouinard, and then people you would never even know of, never heard of. And I feel like it really doesn't matter who it is. As far as listens, I think it's all about the content. And so I love going. Today we've gone down some random, right? We talked about business, and I feel like our show is totally different than Tom's show. It's totally different than April's and everybody's, and that's why it's great. It's unique, and it's, just like anything, you want something to be unique. So I appreciate you for coming on here today, John. This has been awesome. I'm excited and hope to keep in touch with you, because you have this amazing story about surviving for, 20 years with this illness, and hopefully we'll be in touch. And thanks for all your inspiration today and everything you do.
Hey, thank you, Dave. I really appreciate it. It was a pleasure. And yeah, I loved going down the, side roads we went down. And like you say, be different. It's a good motto.
There we go. If finding perspective through fly fishing to process some of life's biggest challenges is interesting to you, or if casting, as we talked about, in the face of uncertainty is important, hope you enjoyed this one. John obviously has a story that is unique, and I want you to follow John if you get a chance at JB Gluck. Let him know you heard this podcast. You can pick up his book, as we mentioned, anytime. And we also mentioned Wetfly Swing Pro. You can go to wetflyswing.com/pro and get on the list when we open this up on our next big launch, which is coming very soon. Get your name on the list, and we'll let you know when it opens up, and we have a big challenge coming during that week as well. I hope you enjoyed this one. We've got some big trips coming up this year, including Montana. We're going to be in Montana. We're going to be out west, and we're working on one on the east side as well. So if you're interested in any of these trips, Wetfly Swing Pro is the place to be. We've got some good ones coming up, as always, in the bucket, Littoral Zone, Great Lakes Dude podcast. If you want to hear more and get feedback to me, send me an email, dave@wetflyswing.com. I want to thank you for stopping by today. Hope you have a great morning, great afternoon, or if it's evening, hope you have a wonderful evening, and thanks for spending time with us today. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for listening to the Wetfly Swing Fly Fishing Show. For notes and links from this episode, visit wetflyswing.com.